We're going to move from rationalism toward existentialism. Now, um, I think I mentioned this in the last video. I may not have, um, but we have this time of rationalism and empiricism that kind of ushers in for us and opens up the door to this movement that's called the Enlightenment. And Enlightenment thinking grows. It's called the Enlightenment to contrast it with the Dark Ages and the Middle Ages. I think we've talked about that a couple of times before. The superstition, the religious ideation, the reliance on sorcery and witchcraft, and all those things. That was part of the Dark Ages and the Middle Ages. The Enlightenment really is called that because this wave of rational thinking and empirical thinking movement towards science kind of embodies the opposite end of the spectrum from the Dark and Middle Ages. I just realized that I'm in a t-shirt and a golf cap, so I, I guess I could have changed clothes, but I thought, well, I'm going to go up there and do some videos. So I apologize. I hope that my casual attire doesn't throw you off. I know you're used to seeing me, all dressed up. But my guess is that you're as casual or more casual than I am, so maybe that's fine. Anyway, so the Enlightenment opens the door to lots of new ways of thinking. And then in kind of in contrast to the push toward rationalism and empiricism, scientific thinking, in other words, we see this other kind of side of philosophy and psychology begin to emerge, and it's what we would call romanticism and then existentialism. Now, romanticism is not romantic. So you can read this in your text. In your text, we're talking about chapter 7. And it says at the opening of the chapter that romanticism was not about not about what we think of like romantic love, but it was romantic in that it emphasized the irrational parts of us. Rather than emphasizing our rational selves. And if you think about that, that's kind of, it really is kind of the same definition. When we think about something being romantic, or if we talk about romantic love, we're talking about a love that's not necessarily rational. That romance is this thing that overcomes sometimes even rational arguments or empirical arguments. And so the Romantics basically said that if you want to understand people, you have to understand the irrational parts of us, not just the rational parts of us. So the Romantics and the Existentialists emphasize this totally separate part of a person. Now, we're not going to spend a lot of time on Romanticism because I want to talk more about existentialism, but you can read the short section in your text about Romanticism. Rousseau is in there, Goethe, and then listed in there is also Arthur Schopenhauer. Now, Schopenhauer is listed in the group of Romanticists, but it's really hard to put Schopenhauer in the romantic category because he's so unpleasant as a philosopher. In fact, the classic picture of Schopenhauer is on page 202 in your text, and you can just look at him and say, well, this is a really unhappy, grumpy person, and that's Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer was he's considered a romantic because he focuses on the not the rational but kind of the irrational. But Schopenhauer is very, very negative. He has this totally dim view of pretty much everything. He's a German philosopher. Shows up. Let's talk about him here. Then we'll go back to existentialism. Schopenhauer focuses on suffering and pain and death. Basically, he's very chauvinistic. Your text, uh, he had says most of his relationships were very casual and involved prostitutes and servant girls. Um, he didn't have a lot of it doesn't seem that Schopenhauer had a lot of care for other people much at all. Uh, he believes um, that the strongest force that we have is kind of this will to survive, this will to fight off impending and inevitable death. And he viewed life as just a series of things that we did to try to postpone death. Lots of focus on suffering, and part of the little uniqueness of Schopenhauer was that he believed that we suffer basically all of our lives, and that the people who are most intelligent suffer the most. And if you think about it, that kind of makes a little bit of sense. If you look on the other end of that spectrum, would be the other end of that spectrum would be the idea that ignorance is bliss. And so Schopenhauer says, well, yeah, then if ignorance is bliss, then those of us who are most intelligent are on the other end of the spectrum from bliss, and that is that we constantly suffer. So for Schopenhauer, the more you knew, the more that you understood, the more that you got about life, then the more suffering you actually experienced and the more horrible it was. Now, Schopenhauer is not terribly important to us, except that he is this person who goes to the other end of the spectrum from rationality. I mean, none of this is terribly rational, because if you think, well, let's look at this empirically or rationally, we might think, well, yeah, things are bad sometimes, but they're also good sometimes, and there is suffering, but there's also joy, and all that kind of thing that you and I would probably, those conclusions we would come to. Schopenhauer ignores the rational and the empirical side of that, and just says basically, that the modern version of Schopenhauer is the bumper sticker that says life sucks and then you die. That's Schopenhauer. And not only did he believe that was true, but that suffering comes from other people. He believed that the vast majority of suffering that we experience just came from having to deal with other people. So he's really negative. He's really dim. He's really sad. But he's kind of important to us because he kind of has this influence over Freud. Freudian theory, contains that notion of the thanatos, the death instinct, and then the will to fight against that. And so there's probably a little bit of influence there on Freud, and you can read about that in your text. He also your text says on 204 that anticipating Freud, Schopenhauer observed that all humans have positive intellectual, rational, and negative animalistic impulses. So that Freudian notion of these kind of internal, instinctual kind of impulses, those, Schopenhauer was aware of that and kind of wrote about that a little bit. So Schopenhauer is really kind of this kind of existential, kind of romantic person, but is kind of interesting to me just because he's so incredibly negative. Now, we go back and let's talk for a minute about some foundational ideas of existentialism. And I hope that if nothing else happens here, that you get that existentialism is not maybe what you thought it was, if you've ever thought of it before or heard of it before. For Christian people in particular, existentialism has in most conservative Christian circles, existentialism has been a really negative thing. It's been a thing that we associated with atheism almost always, and existentialism has been this thing that the fundamentalist Christian teacher or preacher who say, you need to stay away from philosophy because philosophy's bad and philosophy will ruin your faith and those types of things. Well, existentialism has been a part of that. Um, and and so there are a lot of Christian people who, without really knowing anything about existentialism, have kind of dismissed it. Um, but the truth is, existentialism is not an atheistic pursuit. It really begins as a Christian idea, and then there's kind of this simultaneous development of atheistic existentialism. But really, the initial existentialist is Soren Kierkegaard, who was very Christian. So if anything here, I want you to have a little bit of an open mind to the notion of existential philosophy and then existential theology, because I think that it's a really valuable thing. And it's a really valuable thing for psychology, because there are several principles of existential thinking that show up in really what I think are the very best and most productive and most useful ideas that are part of therapy and trying to help people with issues. So existentialism, I think, has a lot to teach us. So some things here that we'll talk through. Number one, it's about existence. So there's a focus in existentialism on the notion of being or non-being. Now, if you just pull somebody out of the grocery store and say, what does it mean to be or not to be? They're going to think that you're quoting Shakespeare, but they're not going to know how to answer that question most of the time, because we don't sit around and think about the question of being very much. But it's a good question. It's an important question. It's really one of those things that's kind of foundational. It's at the heart of everything that we are. Is do I exist? And if I do, why? Why am I here? Now we take that and we turn that into lots of other things, like I found my purpose in life, or I've discovered who I am, or those kinds of phrases. But at the bottom of that is really kind of an existential question. Why do I exist? And what am I doing here? The other part of that that's really kind of important and I think really does speak to Christian people, or people of any faith really, is the idea that to have some understanding of my existence, it may be that I need to at least face the possibility of my non-existence. And you've probably heard people talk about that, having an existential crisis or an existential moment. Well, the existential crisis happens to you when you are faced with not existing, when you're faced with mortality, and some of you have had that experience. You've had an experience where you were in a horrible car accident or something, and maybe someone else didn't make it through that, and you did, and you think, oh my gosh, I could be dead. Or some of you may have had things happen directly to you that to where your life was in danger or you were at risk. And when that happens to you, you have that most of the time what we call an existential crisis, which is the idea of, wow, I exist, but I came this close to not existing, or I might not exist anymore. That's a possibility. Now, I would propose to you that even if you're a Christian person, or even if your faith kind of holds the idea that there's existence after death, the impact on us is very often still there. I actually believe that there's something after I die. I don't know exactly what that is or what it'll be like, but I believe that there is something. But even though I believe that there is some existence after my physical body dies on earth, I still, when I'm faced with the notion that this life might be over, that's a bit of a psychological crisis for me. So sometimes Christian people get hung up on the notion that existentialism is about dying and existence is over. Not necessarily. So that's one thing. There's a focus on being or not being, existence or the possibility of non-existence. Second thing, there is a struggle, there's a focus on struggle and pain and death. Now, this is why I think Schopenhauer maybe feels a little bit more like an existentialist to me than a romanticist, although there aren't any real perfect categories. But existentialism deals with human pain, human suffering, human struggle, and facing death, facing the possibility of non-existence. So the existential philosophers are about that. It's not all joy and happiness and sunlight and and rainbows. It's about living a hard life and dealing with hard things, and understanding what suffering is, and understanding why suffering happens to us, or at least trying to, maybe not totally understanding any of that, but trying to understand some of that. The third thing that's always a part of existential thinking is a focus on freedom and the way that we tend to run from freedom. Now, we could think, well, why would we run from freedom? Don't we love the idea of freedom? Don't we all want to be free? Don't we all want to have freedom? Well, yeah, kind of. Except that existentialism points out the idea to us that with freedom comes, you know what I'm going to say, with freedom comes responsibility. Now, that happens in a philosophical way to people throughout our lives, but it also happens in really kind of practical ways, right? If you get a driver's license and you can drive a car, then you have earned some level of freedom from your parents or whatever, or the freedom of movement, the freedom to go places. But with that comes this enormous responsibility. Next week, we have the freedom to vote for president and for senators and congresspeople. But with that freedom to vote comes a responsibility. Now, here's a practical application of that. There are people who are saying, well, I don't want to vote in a way that's that could be wrong or could be harmful or could be wasted, and therefore I'm just not going to. There are some people who, rather than saying, well, I voted for Hillary, or I voted for Trump, or I voted for one of those other people, they're happier with the idea of saying next Wednesday, I just didn't vote. I just didn't vote for anybody. Well, we understand that feeling, but we know that when you embrace a freedom, you have to embrace the responsibility that goes with it. And that person that decides not to vote is basically afraid of the freedom. They're running from the freedom. They're saying, I don't want that freedom. I'll let other people make choices for me. That way I don't have to be responsible. And we can do that all the time, right? You can not work hard on something, or you can not try something, or you can let other people make choices for you, and then you can blame it on them. The fear is that if I take responsibility, then I have to live. If I take hold of the freedom, then I have to also take responsibility. So existentialism points this out and makes us face that. How do we deal with freedom and the fear of freedom, the responsibility that comes with it? The fourth thing, very closely related to the third thing, is that we have choice. And number 5, that we have will. We can choose things. We can decide things. We can say, I will do this. I won't do that. We can choose to vote for someone. We can choose I can choose to come up here and do a video with the cap on. I can choose to come up here on a Sunday afternoon. I can choose to not watch the boring football game that was on and come do this. You can choose to review this video instead of doing something else. You can choose what you eat for dinner. Of course, that just goes on and on and on. Well, existentialism says, yes, we have that ability. However, because we're afraid of that freedom, sometimes we don't do the choice. Sometimes we ignore the choice, or we let people make the choice for us. So existentialism says we have will, we have choice. I have efficacy. I can make things happen. I can do things. I'm not just a puppet. I'm not just manipulated by the universe or by God. I have choice. So a focus on being, not being, a focus on struggle and pain and death and dealing with the hard parts of life, a focus on freedom, choice, having a will, but the fear of those things and how we tend to run from those things because we're scared of the responsibility. And then lastly, there's atheistic existentialism versus Christian existentialism. And we're going to talk about that pretty specifically. We're going to compare and contrast the two main existential philosophers, the first one being Soren Kierkegaard, who is very much Christian, and the second one being, oh my gosh, I just lost his name. That's a little bit embarrassing. Nietzsche, sorry. The second one being, I was mixing in my mind Jean-Paul Sartre and Nietzsche, and I couldn't get to Nietzsche. Man, that's a little scary. So we're going to kind of compare and contrast Kierkegaard with Nietzsche. And you'll see that there are some real clear similarities between those two. But there are very clear differences in terms of Nietzsche being totally atheistic and dismal, and Kierkegaard being very Christian and even hopeful, although Kierkegaard is very much about dealing with pain and fear and death and those sorts of things. But there's a hope in there because Kierkegaard is a believer. So we'll talk through those and kind of see the differences, the similarities of all of those different people. Now, this is going to be a short one. I'll come back and do another one tomorrow to kind of finish up and to talk about Kierkegaard and Nietzsche. So we'll stop right here, and then I'll be back to you with the rest of this.